Today, we're going to be looking at psychological research. We're going to talk about the Bobo doll experiment, Genie, and some of the theories that go along with research, as well as why we have ethics today. So, why is research important? Research is important because it's grounded in objective, tangible evidence that can be observed time and time again, regardless of who's observing it. Without research, we would only have intuition and groundless assumptions. Research, we're able to prove ideas and studies with testing. Psychology is a science, therefore, research is required to investigate and provide verification and support to findings. For example, our ancestors used to use trephination, which is a practice of making a hole in the skull to allow evil spirits to leave the body, thus curing mental illness and other disorders. Now, with research, we can prove this doesn't work. Trephination is still used today, but more in medical terms for pressure in the skull. So, advertising campaigns sometimes use quote unquote scientific evidence when in reality this is based off of belief. It's not actually used based off of research. So, you have to think critically about claims. What is the expertise of the person? What might they gain if the claim is valid? Does the claim have the justification? And what do the researchers think of the claim? And a good example is the DARE program that is popular in high schools despite research suggesting it's ineffective. The process of scientific research uses inductive and deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is results are predicted based on a general premises. Example, all living things require energy to survive. A premise, therefore ducks are living, and therefore ducks require energy to survive. Inductive reasoning is conclusions are drawn from observations. So you may see fruit growing on a tree and therefore assume all fruit grows on a tree. Scientists form ideas through deductive reasoning, hypotheses are then tested through empirical observations, and conclusions through inductive reasoning. These conclusions lead to new theories or hypotheses. A theory is a well developed set of ideas that propose an explanation for an observed phenomena, while a hypothesis is a tentative and testable statement, a prediction, about a relationship between two or more variables. An example of if then statement predicts how the world will behave in theory if correct, but it is falsifiable. A falsifiable hypothesis, we have an example with Freud. Freud had a theory of the division of the mind into the id, ego, and superego. This has fallen out of favor because they are not falsifiable. His views set the stage for much of psychological thinking today, such as the unconscious nature of the majority of psychological processes. There are various types of research methods. For a clinical or case study, we can look at the example of Jeannie. Jeannie was studied by psychologists after she was found at the age of 13, having suffered severe abuse and social isolation. Psychologists were interested in the effect of social isolation had on her development. So, a clinical or case study focuses on one individual, usually in extreme or unique circumstances. Next, with naturalistic observation, this is basically observing behavior in its natural setting. Naturalistic behavior is general hidden under scrutiny or observation. To study the most accurate and genuine behaviors, naturalistic observation has proven the most effective. Through naturalistic observation, any feeling of performance or anxiety of the studied individuals is eliminated. A big reason for this is we have a thing called observer bias. This is when observations may be skewed to align with the observer's expectation. So basically, an establishment of clear criteria to observe should help eliminate the observer bias. Surveys are a list of questions that can be delivered in many ways, such as paper and pencil, electronically, or verbally. Surveys can be used to gather a large amount of data from a sample, so basically a subset of individuals, from the larger population. Archival research uses past records or data sets to answer various research questions or to search for interesting patterns or relationships. A lot of times in your bachelor's, maybe even master's, professors will kind of encourage a simpler version of archival research within the class projects. With cross-sectional research, this compares multiple segments of a population at a single time, such as different age groups in an elementary and how they feel about emotions, or how they do on their math. Longitudinal studies are which the same group of individuals is surveyed or measured repeatedly over an extended period of time. Researchers often expect some participants to drop out, which is known as a attrition, reduction in number of research participants. Particularly in this type of study, This is very common, therefore, they often initially recruit a lot of participants to be a part of the study. With correlational research, we look at correlation, which is the relationship between two or more variables. When two variables are correlated, one variable changes as the other does. So we have correlation coefficient, positive correlation, and negative correlation. Correlation coefficient is a number between -1 and +1, indicating the strength and direction of the relationship, usually represented by R. Positive correlation is when two variables change in the same direction, both becoming either larger or smaller. Negative correlation is when two variables change in different directions, with one becoming larger as the other becomes smaller. A negative correlation is not the same thing as no correlation. Correlation does not mean causation. We have a cause and effect relationship, so changes in one variable causes changes in the other variable. We have a confounding variable, which is an unanticipated outside factor that affects both variables of interest, often giving a false impression that changes in one variable causes changes in the other. As an example, ice cream sales increase, and so does the rate of crime. A relationship exists between ice cream and crime, but is it correlated or does just one cause the other? In this example, temperature is the confounding variable. As temperature increases, ice cream sales increase, and people are more likely to be outside, increasing crime rates. Illusory correlation is seeing a relationship between two things. In reality, there is no such relationship. In this, confirmation bias plays a role. This is the tendency to ignore evidence that disproves ideas or beliefs. Illusionary correlations can involve in the formation of prejudicial attitudes that can lead to discriminatory behavior. The only way to establish that there is a cause and effect relationship between two variables is to conduct a scientific experiment. A scientific experiment has precise requirements for design and implementation. So, for example, the hypothesis can be formulated through observation and after reviewing previous research. So, an example is seeing behavior such as violence on TV can lead to violent behaviors in children. In designing an experiment, we have an experimental group and a control group. An experimental group is the participants that experience the manipulated variable, so the group designed to answer the question. The control group are participants that do not experience the manipulated variable. They serve as a basis for comparison and control the chance factors that may influence the study. An operational definition is a description of what actions and operations will be used to measure the dependent variable and then to manipulate the independent variable. Experimental manipulation is the only difference between the experimental and control groups, so any differences between the two are due to the experimental manipulation rather than chance. With this, we have a single and double blind study. A single blind study is the experiment in which the researchers know which participants are the experimental group. A double blind study is both researchers and participants are blind to the assignments of the group. Experimenter bias is the researcher expectation skews the results, while a participant bias, the participant's expectations skew the results. So, a way to prevent this is with the placebo effect. The placebo effect is when people's expectations or beliefs influence or determine the experience in a given situation. When people are given a pill to improve their mood may increase just because they believe it will. To know if a medication is really having an effect or whether it's a placebo effect, the experimental group must receive the medication and the control group receive a placebo treatment, such as a sugar pill. This is an example of a double blind study. Any differences in the groups will be due to the actual medication. An independent variable is the variable that is influenced or controlled by the experimenter. Ideally, this should be the only important difference between the experimental and control group. A dependent variable is a variable that the researcher measures to see how much an effect of the independent variable has had. The participants are the subjects of the psychological research. So, obviously, the population is too large for everyone to be included, so samples are used. A sample is a subset of individuals selected from the larger population. The population is the overall group of individuals the researcher is interested in, example, college students. A random sample is a subset of a larger population in which every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. This form of sampling is more preferred because it is more likely that the selected participants will be representative of the larger population. With assigning participants to groups, we have something called random assignment. This is a method of experimental group assignment in which all participants have an equal chance of being assigned to either group. This can be achieved using statistical software or simply by flipping a coin. This prevents systematic differences between groups, such as gender or age. Without random assignment, an experiment cannot find a true cause and effect relationship. Any relationship could be due to a pre existing difference between the groups. Random assignment helps avoid pre existing systematic differences so that any significant differences between groups would be the result of manipulation. There are some issues to consider. As stated, random assignment is required to state causation. Once randomly assigned, each group is then manipulated in some way. However, some experimental designs are more complicated. For example, the effect of gender, male or female, on a spatial memory. Sex is considered an independent variable that cannot be manipulated, and males and females cannot be randomly assigned. This kind of experiment is therefore called a quasi experimental. The cause and effect relationship cannot be determined by this type of experiment. With ethics, some questions cannot be answered using an experimental design because it would be unethical. For example, if you want to study abuse, you cannot randomly assign participants to receive abuse. This would be better used for a case study or surveys. When interpreting experimental findings, we have statistical analysis, which determines how likely any differences between experimental groups is due to chance. So once the data has been collected, this statistical analysis will be conducted. Psychologists usually discuss results as significant or non significant. If the odds of differences occur by a chance of 5% or less, then the results are significant. A true experiment, including random assignment, manipulation of the independent variable, and control of extraneous variables reduce the odds of results occurring by chance. When it comes to reporting findings, research is usually reported in scientific journals. This is aimed at an audience of professionals and scholars so that they are peer reviewed journaled articles. A peer reviewed journal article is an article read by several other scientists, usually anonymously, with expertise in the subject matter, who provide feedback regarding the quality of the manuscript before it's accepted for publication. This weeds out poorly conceived or executive studies, improves articles with suggested revisions, and determines whether the research is described clearly enough to replicate by other researchers. Replication determines the reliability of original research design, can include additional measures that expand on original findings, and can provide more evidence to support the original finding or to cast doubt on those findings. Research can be taken back if it's not proven accurate. For example, there was research saying that childhood vaccines cause some children to develop autism. Since these reports, large scale research was carried out suggesting that vaccinations are not responsible for causing autism. Many of the original studies have then been retracted. It was found that the leading research in the original study had a financial interest in establishing a link between childhood vaccines and autism. Unfortunately, these claims were publicized, and many people still believe vaccinations cause autism. Which leads us to reliability and validity. Reliability is the consistency and reproducibility of a given result. For example, would the same test give the same result every single time? When a study involves observations by multiple people, it is important that they all make observations and record them in the same way, which is interlateral reliability, the measure of agreement among observers on how they record and classify a particular event. A reliability consistent measurement does not always mean that it's measuring something correctly. So there is validity, which is the accuracy of a given result in measuring what it's designed to measure. The question is, does a test measure what it's meant to measure? There are ethics that play a huge role in research. We have the Institutional Review Board, known as the IRB, that is a committee of administrators, scientists, and community members that review proposals for research involving human participants. This also includes informed consent, a process of information a research participant about what to expect during the experiment, and then obtaining the person's consent to participate. This includes the risks, the implications, that it's voluntary, and the data that is collected is confidential. Just like there are ethics for humans, there are ethics for animals, known as the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. This is a committee of administrators, scientists, veterans, and community members that review proposals for research involving non human animals. Sometimes deception is necessary to prevent a participant from knowing what the research question is. as long as it's not considered harmful. Deception is purposely misleading an experiment participant in order to maintain the integrity of the experiment. Debriefing is when an experiment involved deception, participants are told the complete and truthful information about the experiment at its conclusion. So, in the conformed consent, you're not going to see, oh, this research involves deception. You will find that out at the end with the debriefing. In an example where ethics did not exist, we have 1932, where participants were recruited in an experiment studying syphilis in black men. Participants that tested positive were not informed that they had the disease. Although no cure existed at the beginning of the study, a cure was found in 1947, which was penicillin, but it was not administered to the participants. Many participants unknowingly spread the disease, and many died. When looking at animal research, 90% of psychological research involving animal subjects uses rodents or birds. Animals make a good substitute because many of their basic processes are sufficiently similar to those in humans. Animals are used when the research would be unethical in human participants. Researchers must aim to minimize pain or distress for the animals. Another research experiment that's very popular is the Stanford Prison Experiment. This revealed profound insights into human behavior under authority. It was conducted in 1971 by psychologist Phil Zimbardo. This controversial study involved college students assigned to roles as either guards or prisoners in a stimulated prison environment. In another study involving obedience, we have Milgram's obedience study. The Milgram experiment highlights the extent of human obedience to authority. Conducted by psychologist Stanley Milgram in the early 1960s, this series of experiments aimed to understand how far individuals would go in obeying an authority figure, even when it involved causing harm to another person. In this study, nobody was physically harmed, but the participants did believe that they were giving somebody electrical shocks every time they got the answer wrong. The Jane Elliott Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes experiment is a famous anti racism simulation created by Iowa schoolteacher Jane Elliott in 1968. It was designed to teach third grader students about the arbitrary nature of discrimination. It divided a class by eye color, blue eye, brown eye, and granted privileges to one group while subjecting the other to prejudice. In the marshmallow study test, a Stanford marshmallow test conducted by psychologist Walter Minshall in the 1960s, is a classic experiment on delayed gratification. Preschoolers were offered one treat now, or two if they waited 15 minutes. Initial studies suggested that those who waited achieved better grades, higher incomes, and better health as adults.